The AOC XF270HUA is seriously impressive, and I'm going to tell you why throughout this review. Now, the monitor has a full HD resolution, runs an IPS panel, and 240Hz. It's also got a 24-inch form factor. Now, that's not to be confused with the C24G2ZU, and yes, AOC made it pretty clear with the C in the front, because the curved variant has a VA panel instead. You can find a review of that monitor in case you're interested up on your pop-up banner or down in the description below. Now, just a little disclaimer, the AOC XF270G2ZU has a sibling, the AOC XF270HUA. This monitor, as in the ZE variant, has a fixed stand and no USB hub. This is not the model that we have on review today, although otherwise they share the exact same panel. And yes, as an FYI, it's an IPS panel, not a TN panel that some retailers list. So jumping straight in, let's talk about its gaming performance, and quite frankly, I was left absolutely jaw-dropped. AOC have absolutely nailed the input lag and the response time of this monitor. They're simply phenomenal. First off, let's talk about response time. Now, there's a few different settings you can choose through the OSD where you can choose the overdrive level. You've got the weak, medium and strong modes, and then you've got boost mode. Now, boost mode will limit the overall brightness of the monitor to the point where I feel it's way too dim for most users to play on. Unless you play in an absolutely pitch black room, then it might be acceptable for you to get away, but frankly, if I couldn't see my enemies, that kind of defeats the point of boost mode. Nevertheless, in strong overdrive mode, there was very little inverse ghosting, meaning that I could run on strong overdrive mode and not incur any purple trailing around my enemies, be it on Counter-Strike Global Offensive or even more casual games such as Destiny 2. Indeed, the monitor does perform extraordinarily well in terms of its response time, and it feels extremely responsive. Now, the same could be said about its input lag. It is absolutely phenomenal. For someone who's played over 2,000 hours of competitive Counter-Strike and reviewed over 190 monitors, it is a monitor I would safely see myself using in competitive gaming, and that includes at Global Elite level on Counter-Strike Global Offensive. So yes, it is a monitor you can use for competitive gaming at no matter what level gaming that you're playing at. Given Counter-Strike is a great benchmark for esports, I think it's safe to say, well, this monitor can be used for that purpose. Now, elsewhere there is MBR mode. That means you can limit the overall motion blur that you attain from the monitor. The only thing to bear in mind over here is that it can't be used simultaneously with adaptive sync, although I would probably suggest you not even running adaptive sync in the first place. And then elsewhere, the MBR mode will also limit the peak brightness and will lock the brightness to the 20 level increments that it provides. In level 20 mode, it's pretty much equivalent to the same level of brightness you'll get in boost overdrive mode, and frankly, it is too dim for me to like or use, but of course you might differ from me. You might game in a completely pitch black room, and as such here, it might be actually acceptable to your eyes. Now, I did quickly reference adaptive sync, and indeed this monitor has got AMD FreeSync. The FreeSync range is from 48Hz up to 240Hz, which is great to see. Now, in my case, I have an NVIDIA graphics card, an RTX 2080 Super to be more specific, and connected over DisplayPort, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. Now here, I did notice that kind of black screens were appearing when I was enabling G-Sync. So just to make myself aware to see that if there was any flickering issues or any sort of stuttering that would occur or artifacts, I played some Destiny 2 at 240Hz at full HD with G-Sync enabled, and they all ran simultaneously without any hiccups whatsoever. So as a result, I can say in terms of my setup, I was able to run NVIDIA G-Sync. Now, it should be mindful that this monitor does not have an NVIDIA G-Sync module built in, but instead it's got an AMD FreeSync technology built in, and thus is why it's a little bit cheaper than some of its competitors. Now, elsewhere, the monitor does not have any HDR certificate, and quite frankly, it's no surprise over here. Even HDR 400 is a little bit laughable in terms of including it. Unlike the Acer VG270HUA, which does have it, I wasn't really left impressed by its HDR performance, but it's just something I should point out in case it's something that you're really looking for in terms of HDR capabilities. Well, this monitor does not have it, and as a result, you might want to look at the Asus alternative instead. Now, while its gaming performance is absolutely spectacular, what about in terms of its image quality? Well, it has an IPS panel inside, and when I put it through its paces with the Datacolor Spider X Elite, I found that the gamut coverage in terms of sRGB sat at 99%, and gamut volume was 112.3%. You can see over here how it compares to the overall standard, the sRGB standard, where it's slightly warmer in terms of tones. Now, as a result of being slightly skewed. You can see that the average DLT relies at 1.78 and a maximum of 5.61. Frankly, I was expecting a slightly better result, but it is perfectly acceptable for a gaming monitor, but you should just be mindful that if you are going to be editing pictures or video grading, you might want to look and invest in terms of a color calibrator. Even in terms of its sRGB mode, it's not pinpoint accurate. Now, to further emphasize the point, you do have a few different color modes to choose from, and in terms of the warm mode, this might be pretty pleasing to most people's eyes, purely because, well, it doesn't have a limited brightness unlike the sRGB mode. Now, as such here, in terms of its warm color mode, I found that the gamut coverage relied at 99.1% in sRGB and 111.5% in gamut volume. You can see here again it extends over in terms of the warmer tones, and yet again in terms of the overall color accuracy, it does drop very slightly to an average DLT of 1.94 and a maximum of 5.59. Frankly, if it was me and I was a gamer, I'd run it in terms of its warm mode and therefore not be limited in terms of peak brightness, and furthermore have the ability to still have a really nice looking monitor. Now, while its pinpoint sRGB accuracy won't be of much interest or importance to some gamers, the contrast ratio will be. Here I measured 720 to 740 to 1, which is a little bit below par in comparison to other IPS monitors out there. Now, in this respect, I do understand that my color calibrator does report contrast ratio slightly lower than others out there, but still it's to be mindful of that I recently tested some other IPS monitors out there and they achieved far greater results than this monitor did. Now, moving swiftly on, we get onto peak brightness, and as I did mention, in terms of sRGB mode, it does limit the peak brightness to around 190 nits. Now, if you take it out of its sRGB mode, say such as warm mode, you get around 350 nits, which is plenty bright. Minimum brightness gets down to 71 nits. However, you can even go that further step forwards if you enable the boost overdrive mode or the MBR at level 20 that I mentioned before, and here peak brightness gets limited to just 40 odd nits. Now, past this, we have got brightness uniformity, and there is a element of panel lottery, so your panel might differ from mine, but the one that was tested here didn't do too well in terms of the top half of the segment, and this really did come across when I did the backlight bleed test as well. I did notice a little bit of IPS bleed coming through specifically at the top corners of the monitor, but again, this is to be expected of an IPS panel, but as to how much you can deal with it or how much is acceptable to you, well, only you will know that answer. What I will say here is I didn't have too many problems gaming at night. So moving on to the monitor's OST, it's pretty comprehensive. Now, through the luminance, it's pretty much subjective as to what you want, and as for the color temperature, as I did mention in the image quality section, the sRGB will be preferred. However, this will limit the overall brightness that you can achieve, so gamers might actually prefer the warm mode. At least that's what I preferred. Now, Picture Boost does as the name suggests, but in my case it's not something that I would use. As for the OSD, again, pretty self-explanatory, allows you to customize the OSD settings and also add a break reminder or the USB enabled or disabled. Now, as for the game settings, this is quite interesting. I do find it quite intriguing that the low input lag mode is being grayed out and enabled. You can't disable it, and frankly I'm not really sure why you want to disable it, but the option has been grayed out, at least for me, and I couldn't find a way to disable it. Now, as for the game modes, I wouldn't suggest running through them, and no, before you ask, that doesn't re-enable the input lag modes for you to disable, but it just skews with the colors and it's not something that I personally like. Now, as for overdrives, there are a few different modes, as I did talk about in terms of the gaming section, and as for the boost mode, which comes in right there, not only does it limit the peak brightness, which my camera should be picking up, but it is only available if adaptive sync is disabled, so they can't be simultaneously there. Now, when adaptive sync is enabled, you'll go up to strong overdrive only, and arguably that's potentially where you'd want to run it at anyway due to the overall brightness. Now, the same could be said about MBR. MBR can't be used simultaneously with adaptive sync, so it's something to be again mindful of, and yet again, if you go for MBR, it's going to limit the peak brightness specifically in terms of its maximum mode, which is level 20. And as for extras, it's pretty self-explanatory yet again, but the only thing that might be intriguing is the fact that you can double check the resolution and the refresh rate that you're running at. Now, finally, we get onto the build quality and the stand, and here the monitor has a three-side borderless design where the bottom bezel isn't too thick either. I also do like that the red and black theme has actually kind of been slightly improved, at least in my opinion. It's got a slightly red metallic metallic kind of look instead of a kind of red shiny look, which will mean that certain gamers out there which really didn't like that red look of previous AOC iterations might find this a little bit more pleasing to their eyes, but of course that is subjective. Now the stand itself provides height, tilt, pivot, and can be also rotated, so it gives you a full array of adjustment, and while it is made out of plastic, I did find it to be really sturdy, and given the size of the monitor as well, meant that I had no issues whatsoever. Frankly, the AOC 24G2ZU is my favourite Full HD 240Hz monitor, and as a result gets my Best Buy award. But you should also consider there are 1440p 144Hz monitors out there on the market that come in at roughly the same price. So links in the description below will show some of my favourites, because doubling the resolution at the sacrifice of dropping that refresh rate might be better for you if you're not a hardcore esports fanatic. Now, if you like this video, drop a like, and of course subscribe and hitting that bell notification would be all greatly appreciated. Alright, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care of yourselves, and goodbye.